She was the doctor's wife, sitting stiffly in a pine-board pew while bruises bloomed beneath her Sunday dress. And the words she whispered to the sheriff's wife, "It hurts when I sit," were met with a tight, pitying smile and the advice to be a more dutiful spouse. The town had already decided she was hysterical, clumsy, prone to exaggeration. But a one-armed tinsmith, a man the town called a sour drunk, overheard those 4 words and did what no soul in that dusty Kansas settlement had dared. He believed her. That single act of belief ignited a chain of consequences that would bury one man's reputation and resurrect a woman's life. Across the West, in mining camps, on lonely homesteads, and in the shadow of the Wichita Mountains, the same quiet miracle repeated itself. Outcasts, children, and the elderly whispered truths that the crowd mocked, but one stubborn heart listened. Tonight, lean close. These are the true stories of being believed when the whole world screamed liar, and the unforgettable price and reward of that faith. In the autumn of 1881, the town of Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, was a respectable grid of brick storefronts and whitewashed churches on the surface. But beneath the starched collars and polite nods, its soul was a knot of willful blindness. And nowhere was that darkness more concentrated than in the household of Dr. Phineas T. Crawley, a portly mutton-chopped physician whose gentle bedside manner in the homes of the wealthy concealed a private monstrousness that turned his young wife, Delilah, into a living anatomy of concealed agony. Delilah Crawley was 23, a girl from a failed Indiana farm who'd married the doctor 3 years prior after he treated her dying mother and offered a ring instead of a bill. And she quickly learned that her husband's rages were as methodical as his prescriptions, selecting the parts of her body that wouldn't show, the small of her back, the tops of her thighs, the tender flesh that met a chair, so she could still serve tea to the Ladies' Aid Society without a single visible mark. The phrase, "It hurts when I sit," was whispered by Delilah to the sheriff's wife, Ernestine Cobb, during a quilting bee in the church basement, a desperate, breathy confession that hung in the air like a feather before Ernestine patted her hand and said, "Men have their burdens, dear. We mustn't add to them with complaints." The entire town's establishment, from the mayor to the pastor, depended on Dr. Crawley's free medical care for the poor and his generous contributions to the new bell tower. So a collective, unspoken agreement was reached. Delilah Crawley was simply a frail, nervous creature, and her occasional limps and flinches were unfortunate feminine vapors. Then, on a raw October evening, a stranger named Rufus Pembroke shuffled into Cottonwood Falls, pushing a battered cart loaded with tin pots, solder, and a peculiar assortment of repaired clocks. A one-armed Civil War veteran whose empty left sleeve was pinned neatly to his shoulder and whose face had been so deeply gouged by shrapnel that children called him the Gargoyle. Rufus set up his tin-smithing operation in a derelict chicken coop behind the livery stable, paying his rent in mended buckets and asking nothing of anyone but to be left alone with his bottle of cheap rye and his tattered copy of Leaves of Grass. Delilah Crawley, whose husband had forbidden her to hire help for the endless kitchen repairs, brought Rufus a leaky copper boiler, and in the dusty yard, while he worked the metal with his single, astonishingly deft hand, she found herself telling him about her mother's garden in Indiana. And then, for no reason she could articulate, she began to cry, and the words tumbled out, about the doctor's careful, clinical beatings, the way he used a rubber hose to avoid bruising her organs, the mockery in his eyes when she winced. Rufus Pembroke stopped his work, set the boiler down, and fixed her with his one good eye, rheumy and bloodshot, and said, "Ma'am, I have seen men's souls laid open on battlefields, and I know a true wound from a fancy. You are telling the truth, and I will not be silent while they bury you standing." The town, of course, immediately dismissed Rufus as a drunken, disfigured malcontent trying to extort the good doctor, and the sheriff, a man named Tully, threatened to run him out on a vagrancy charge. But Rufus, who'd survived the inferno of the wilderness and the prison pens of Andersonville, was not a man who frightened easily. He began a methodical campaign of quiet, relentless advocacy that no one could have predicted from a tinsmith in a chicken coop. He wrote letters to Delilah's only surviving uncle, a farmer in Ohio, describing what he'd witnessed in meticulous, uneducated, but devastating prose. He visited the Cottonwood Falls post office every day until the postmaster, a timid man named Greeley, agreed to testify that he'd once seen the doctor strike Delilah with a walking stick when she'd taken too long mailing a package. And he started showing up at the Crawley home at odd hours, not threateningly, but with the excuse of returning a repaired item, his presence a silent, scarred rebuke to the doctor's facade. The breaking point came when Rufus convinced the town's one female telegraph operator, a 19-year-old orphan named Nellie Spry, to keep a log of Delilah's coded distress signals. A certain shawl hung in an attic window meant, "He's in a rage tonight." A particular flower pot on the back step meant, "I am too injured to leave the house," and then telegraphed the uncle, who arrived on the noon train with a lawyer from Topeka and a writ of protection that had been fast-tracked by a sympathetic judge who'd read Rufus's letters. Dr. Crawley, confronted in his own parlor with the evidence assembled by a one-armed tinsmith the town had branded a degenerate, made the fatal mistake of laughing and saying, "You take the word of a crippled drunk and a hysterical woman over a man who's brought 200 of your children into this world?" And in that moment, the church bell tower donations didn't matter anymore because the rusted, unassailable truth was standing right there in the shape of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Delilah Crawley was granted a divorce, an almost unheard-of legal miracle in that era, and moved to Ohio with her uncle. But before she left, she pressed a small package into Rufus Pembroke's calloused hand. It was the doctor's own gold pocket watch, which she'd taken from his study, and inside the case she'd pasted a scrap of paper reading, "Time belonged to him. Now it belongs to you." Rufus, who never touched a drop of rye again after that morning, stayed in Cottonwood Falls for another 20 years, repairing pots and clocks, and became the unlikely, uncredited guardian of every other woman in that town who needed to whisper a secret. His chicken coop shop a confessional where the grotesque exterior hid the truest heart in the county, proving that often the person who will believe you is the one the world has already thrown away. Down in the shadow of the Wichita Mountains in the spring of 1890, in that tense, bitter era when the Indian Territory was being carved into reservations and the old ways were being forcibly erased, a 14-year-old Kiowa boy named Ade-wa-tai, which translates roughly to "he who sees far," became the scapegoat for a crime that had the entire frontier settlement of Grady's Corner baying for blood. The crime itself was a tragedy. A 7-year-old white settler girl named Millie Banning had wandered away from her family's sod house and drowned in a shallow creek, and her grief-maddened father, a hard-bitten farmer named Lorne Banning, refused to believe it was a simple accident, insisting that someone had lured or pushed his daughter into the water. When a pair of cowboys found young Ade-wa-tai sitting on a rock near the creek 2 hours after the body was discovered, fishing for crawdads with a willow pole, the narrative was instantly, viciously sealed. The Kiowa boy had been seen lurking near the Banning homestead the week before, hungry and hoping to trade a woven basket for cornmeal, and his presence at the scene, combined with the fact that he spoke broken English and couldn't adequately defend himself against the rapid-fire interrogations of the sheriff, made him the perfect vessel for a community's bottomless grief and rage. Ade-wa-tai was locked in the Grady's Corner jail, a 2-cell iron cage in the back of the general store, while Lorne Banning and his friends drank themselves into a lynching fever, sharpening rope knives and muttering that the federal marshal in Fort Smith was too far away to interfere. The only person in Grady's Corner who refused to join the mob's chorus was a 41-year-old spinster named Hephzibah Trotter, a gaunt, myopic woman with a crooked spine and a mouthful of misaligned teeth that made her the target of cruel jokes, who ran the settlement's only lending library out of a converted freight wagon and had spent the past 5 years cataloging the edible plants and medicinal herbs of the region, often trading knowledge with the Kiowa women whom the white settlers dismissed as savages. Hephzibah, known as Hepsy the Mole to the children who mocked her thick spectacles, had been at the creek earlier on the day Millie Banning died, collecting specimens of wild watercress for her botanical journal, and she had seen something that the mob, in its rush to judgment, had completely overlooked. The muddy bank where Millie had slipped bore the clear, deep gouges of a child's own small boot heel sliding down a steep, rain-softened shelf, and there was a broken branch in the shape of a desperate grab, with no other footprints anywhere near the spot except the girl's own. Hephzibah Trotter, who had been ignored and belittled her entire adult life, presented her observations to Sheriff Rusk, a lazy, bullying man who owed his election to the Banning family's support, and was told to go back to her books and let the men handle savage business. But Hephzibah did not retreat. She had learned from her years of cataloging bitter roots and rare ferns that truth, like a hidden flower, takes patience and a willingness to be uncomfortable. That night, while the lynch mob grew louder and drunker, she hitched her mule to her freight wagon, loaded it with her lantern, a blackboard, and a carefully pressed sheet of paper on which she'd sketched a detailed diagram of the creek bank erosion patterns, and rolled it directly into the center of the muddy Main Street in front of the general store, positioning herself between the jail and the mob. Standing on the wagon's bed, her hunched silhouette illuminated by the flickering lantern, she delivered an impromptu, trembling lecture on the science of soil displacement and accidental drowning trajectories, pointing to each mark on her diagram and explaining, in the same methodical tone she used with reluctant schoolchildren, that the physical evidence made it physically impossible for anyone to have been standing next to Millie Banning when she entered the water. The mob, baffled and momentarily shamed by this lecture from a woman they dismissed as a freak, hesitated, and in that hesitation, the settlement's one telegraph key, operated by a nervous young man named Timothy Crump, who had once been taught to read by Hephzibah, began to clatter with a message. A federal marshal and a troop of cavalry from Fort Sill were riding hard, having been alerted a day earlier by Hephzibah's own urgent message, written in telegraph office with Timothy's trembling help. The marshal arrived at dawn, and after examining Hephzibah's careful evidence and interviewing the boy with the aid of a Kiowa translator she had personally fetched from a nearby camp, released Adewa Todd into Hephzibah's custody, declaring the drowning a tragic accident with no foul play involved. The aftermath was not a fairy tale of instant community redemption. The Banning family never forgave her, and for years, someone occasionally scrawled "mole" in manure on her wagon. But Adewa Todd, whose name meant "he who sees far," grew up to become a respected mediator between the Kiowa and the government, and he always credited his survival to the night a crook-backed woman with thick glasses taught an entire town a lesson in true sight, that believing a child no one else will believe can stop a rope from swinging and, in the long, slow creep of time, can begin to heal even the most poisoned ground. In the bleached, rattlesnake-haunted hills of the Mojave Desert in 1903, a 68-year-old prospector named Winslow Lucky Lathrop, whose luck had long since curdled into a reputation for being the most spectacular liar in San Bernardino County, stumbled into the dusty crossroads of Amboy with a lump of quartz shot through with veins of gold so thick they looked like frozen lightning, and a map scrawled on the back of a flour sack that he claimed led to the Mother Lode. Lucky Lathrop was a scarecrow of a man with a beard that hadn't met a comb since the Garfield administration, eyes bleached pale by decades of sun, and a nervous tic that made his left hand flutter like a trapped bird. He'd staggered into Amboy half dead from dehydration, his donkey having perished 5 miles back, and he collapsed in front of the Amboy saloon with the ore sample clutched to his chest, whispering to the assembled loafers that he'd found the Los Padres gold, a legendary vein that Spanish missionaries had supposedly mined and then hidden with a curse 2 centuries earlier. The men of Amboy, a collection of failed miners, railroad drifters, and sour-minded merchants, examined the quartz, admitted it was spectacularly rich, and then collectively decided that Lucky Lathrop, being a known fabulist who previously claimed to have discovered a diamond field in the Panamints and a hot spring that could cure consumption, must have salted the sample, grinding gold flakes into a worthless rock and planting it as bait for investors. They laughed him out of the saloon, threw the flour sack map into the dirt, and the town's unofficial leader, a saloon owner named Dutch Grable, warned everyone not to waste a single dollar or day chasing the ravings of a sun-touched old fool who'd probably just be dead by morning. The one person who did not laugh, who stood in the doorway of the Amboy boarding house with a chipped enamel cup of water in her hand, was a young widow named Iva Pickering, who had arrived in Amboy 3 months earlier after her husband, a railroad section hand, had been crushed between 2 boxcars in a needle-switching yard, leaving her with a $75 burial debt and nothing but a strong back and a stubborn unwillingness to become a laundress or a saloon girl to survive. Iva Pickering had watched Lucky Lathrop's collapse from her window and seen something the others hadn't. His shoes were worn through to the bloody solace. His lips were cracked in a way no temporary stunt could fake, and the calluses on his hands spoke of months, not hours, of swinging a pick. She carried him water, then beef broth, and for 3 days while he lay recovering in a cot in the boarding house shed, she listened to his rambling, feverish descriptions of a hidden canyon where a waterfall of quartz spilled down a granite face, a place he called the Bishop's Mitre because of the rock formation that capped it. And the more she listened, the more she realized that Lucky Lathrop's story, for all its wild embellishments about ghostly monks and guardian rattlers, contained precise geological descriptions that matched the mining reports her late husband had once read to her. Ava Pickering made a decision that every other soul in Amboy considered proof of female foolishness. She sold her husband's last possession, a gold railroad pocket watch, to buy a second-hand bureau, 2 canteens, and a grub steak of bacon, beans, and bicarbonate of soda. And she told Lucky Lathrop she would carry the supplies if he could carry the memory of the route. For 9 days, the 2 most dismissed people in the desert, a broken old liar and a nobody widow, crawled and stumbled through a labyrinth of lava beds and Joshua tree forests, following a flour sack map that only Lucky could interpret through his fevered recollection, until they reached a hidden box canyon that precisely matched the description, a granite wall rising 300 feet, a narrow slot choked with ironwood trees, and, at the very back, a seam of rose quartz so thick with gold that it glowed in the afternoon sun like a promise from the center of the earth. The Los Padres gold was real, and Lucky Lathrop, the man everyone had called a fantasist, wept like a child when he touched the vein again, his thin body shaking with a vindication that went far deeper than riches. They filed a claim at the county seat, naming it the Pickering-Lathrop Mine, and when the first shipment of ore was assayed at over $2,000 a ton in 1903 money, the town of Amboy experienced a collective, stomach-churning shock. The fool and the widow had found the very thing everyone else had been too cynical and too comfortable to seek. Iva Pickering, who became one of the wealthiest women in the territory, never forgot what it felt like to be believed by no one, and she used a portion of her fortune to establish a small, no-questions-asked grubstake fund for the prospectors whom the world called crazy, a fund that over the next decade quietly bankrolled dozens of loners and dreamers, some of whom actually did strike ore and all of whom, at the very least, received the one thing money can't buy, the dignity of being taken seriously. Lucky Lathrop, for his part, lived another 6 years in a small adobe house Iva built for him beside the mine, and on his tombstone, a simple slab of the rose quartz She inscribed the words that summed up the entire improbable saga. Lucky Lathrop, a good liar, a better friend, and a true finder of gold. One woman believed him, and that was enough. The true vein, the story whispers on the desert wind, wasn't the quartz and gold. It was the stubborn, radical act of a woman who looked at a ridiculed old man and chose to see not a con artist, but a soul telling the truth that the crowd was too blind to hear. The American West we were taught about was built on grit and gunpowder, but the deeper truth, buried in tinsmith shops and freight wagons and desert sands, is that it was also held together by the quiet, ferocious courage of one person deciding to believe another when it was infinitely easier to turn away. Delilah's tinsmith, Spinster, and Lucky's widow didn't wear badges or command armies. They simply refused to let a convenient lie crush a vulnerable truth, and that refusal rippled across generations. If these stories of whispered secrets and unlikely saviors moved you, hit like to honor the believers who never made the history books. Subscribe to Stories Hub Official and ring the bell, because we are committed to unearthing these hidden, human-sized pieces of the frontier soul. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being believed can change a life. Tell us in the comments, which of these three quiet defenders would you ride beside into the unknown? Keep the lantern lit. We'll see you at the next campfire.